Now, some women are not going to be able to get pregnant naturally through the use of frozen eggs or embryos that they might have collected before treatment, or through IVF with stimulation after treatment. And so in that case, another option is third-party reproduction. And this basically just means using a third person to help you build your family. This third person can donate an egg or embryo, or this person can allow you to use her uterus to carry a pregnancy for you. So first we'll talk about egg and embryo donation. So how do you find an egg or embryo donor? Basically, there's two ways that you can do this. You can work with a reproductive endocrinologist or fertility center, and they may have their own donor egg program, or you can work with a donation agency. Some people consider using a friend or a relative to donate an egg, and for many people this is a good option, but it is something you have to think about carefully before you proceed with this, because people have great intentions and they want to be generous and do this for you, but there can be a lot of long-term ramifications in terms of what this person's future relationship might be with your child. And so it's really important that if you're considering this, that the donor undergo psychological screening and that you have a formal legal arrangement with them so that there's no unexpected complications down the road. Now, most of the centers that are involved with egg and embryo donation, actually all of them require state licensing, but they will vary in a number of ways. They may have different ways of recruiting for donors. They may have different criteria they use to screen or select donors. They may vary in how much information about the donor they're willing to share with you, and they may vary according to their costs. Now, the criteria that are generally used to select and screen donors, age is very important. They want women who are between 21 and 34 years of age because they're going to have the greatest likelihood of getting lots of healthy eggs. They're going to look at the medical history of the donor and the donor's family. They're going to test the donor for infectious diseases like HIV and hepatitis. Depending on the ethnicity of the donor, if there's a high risk, they may do certain genetic tests. And of course, a very comprehensive psychological assessment. Sometimes they'll also get information about the donor's personal characteristics, their height, their weight, their hair or eye color. They might get information about their personality, about their education, about their hobbies and interests. But regardless of what they collect, you may not have access to this. So it would be really helpful for you to think about what do you want to know about a donor, and then work with a center or agency that's willing to share that information with you. So what's the process involved? Well, the donor will go through the same type of stimulation that I described previously so that lots of eggs will be matured and to be collected. And while the donor is going through ovarian stimulation, you as the recipient would get hormones to prepare your uterus, because remember, you're not producing hormones to create that thick endometrial lining. The eggs will be collected from the donor and fertilized with sperm of your partner or husband or a donor's sperm to create the embryos, and then those embryos will be transferred into your uterus. They'll continue to give you hormones for about 3 months to help support the pregnancy until your body starts taking over producing the hormones. So although you as the mother are not genetically related to the baby, you would get to experience pregnancy and give birth. And it's your child, it's just not your genes. Now, egg donation costs about $15,000 to $25,000. Some of this is to compensate the donor. Usually the donor gets about $8,000. But there's also cost to screen the donor, the medications to stimulate her, the cost of retrieving the eggs. There's the cost of the in vitro fertilization. There's your own cost for medications to prepare your uterus, and the cost for the transfer. And then there are legal and agency fees. Sometimes 2 recipients share the eggs of a single donor, and this can actually reduce the cost quite a lot. So that's being used more and more. Now, with embryo donation, the process is a little bit different, and I will say that embryo donation is very new, and so there's a lot that's a little uncertain about how this works. But basically, the most common way somebody gets an embryo is from another couple who underwent fertility treatment. and created extra embryos that are frozen. And instead of discarding them, this couple has decided to donate them. So that's one way you can get an embryo. You can also create an embryo with donor eggs and donor sperm, but of course that would be much more costly. So the embryo exists, it's frozen from a donor. You're going to take hormones to prepare your uterus. The embryos are thawed, 1 or 2 of them are thawed and transferred to your uterus. And again, like I described before, you'll continue the hormones. So in this situation with embryo donation, neither parent has a genetic relationship to the child, but again, the mom gets to be pregnant and give birth. Embryo donation is generally less money than egg donation because the embryos already exist. The costs of about $10,000 are for screening of the donor, for your medications and transfer, and again for legal fees and agency fees. Now, surrogacy is another type of third-party reproduction which involves arranging for another woman to carry a pregnancy for you. Now, with a traditional surrogate, an embryo is created within the surrogate's body after insemination. So, for example, your husband might might collect semen that would be inseminated into the surrogate, and then his sperm would fertilize her eggs to create the embryo. And then the surrogate carries the pregnancy and delivers the pregnancy. With a traditional surrogate, the surrogate woman is the birth mother and is genetically related to the baby. And as I'm sure you're aware, there have been some legal cases over years where surrogate mothers have not wanted to give up the baby after birth. And so what we're seeing increasingly now is the use of gestational carriers. In this situation, the embryo is created using IVF in a laboratory. There's no, the surrogate's eggs are not used at all, and that embryo is transferred into the carrier's uterus so that although the carrier is the birth mother, she has no genetic relationship at all to this child. So how do you find a carrier? One way is through an agency, and that's used probably most commonly. But sometimes women have relatives or friends who offer to be a carrier for them. And, you know, again, as I mentioned with donor eggs, you know, for some people this can be a really good option. But again, there are potential complications down the road. So it's really important that, that you seek psychological screening and legal assistance if you're going to go that route. So surrogates or carriers are screened. They have to be at least 21 years of age. They should have had a previous delivery of a live child at term. Make sure that they can carry a healthy pregnancy and that they already have a child and know what's involved with giving birth. And they're screened in terms of both their medical and psychological health. Counseling and legal consultation is critical when you're using a surrogate or a carrier. Now, state laws vary quite widely in regard to surrogacy. And so what you have to think about if you're going to use a surrogate or a carrier is the state in which the carrier lives and where they'll give birth. Because not all states will allow for financial compensation for a carrier. So, for example, if you live here in New York, you cannot pay someone in New York State to carry a pregnancy for you. You would have to use a woman who lives and will give birth in, for example, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which are nearby and which do allow financial compensation. States also vary on whose name goes on the birth certificate, whether it's the genetic mother or the birth mother, whether or not adoption is required, and on the rights of the genetic and birth mother. So it's really critical that you work with an attorney who's very knowledgeable about all of this. The cost of this is enormous. It's usually between $50,000 and $100,000. The surrogate or carrier gets compensation of somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000. And then the other costs are for the medical care involved and the fees to the agency and attorney to cover screening of the carriers, matching of the carrier with the prospective parents, the contract, the birth certificate, the adoption, all of this. So, you know, this isn't always an option for everybody because of the costs. So in general, third-party reproduction is really increasing as a way of couples with and without cancer to develop, to build a family, but screening of the third party is really essential. You need to use caution when using family or friends, although I would not say that you shouldn't consider doing it, but you need to be careful. You must have detailed financial agreements and legal agreements so that everyone is clear about the expectations.